This is Darth Brandybuck, researcher of firearms and artillery for the weird gun Iceberg, which includes hundreds of the strangest weapons from throughout history. Today he'll be taking us through level 7 as we dive deeper into some of the most peculiar firearms of all time.
So, the weird gun Iceberg. There's a lot of guns on here that, quite frankly, I hadn't even heard of until starting research for this video, but a lot of them were made for special military programs or experimental trials, so they never would have really seen any wide-scale production, if indeed they were actually ever manufactured at all. And some of these may have seen very limited use by the military or even in the civilian market, but it'd be hard-pressed to find people who've actually ever heard of these guns, let alone even seen them.
Now, as you can probably imagine, researching all of these weird guns takes a whole lot of time, and that's led to a lot of late nights and early mornings. But thankfully, I've got Dubby to give me the energy I need. That's right, baby, we've got our first brand partnership. So, Dubby is a clean energy drink that keeps you alert and focused without having to deal with any of the jitters or the afternoon crash. The caffeine comes from coffee fruit extract, but it's also got lots of vitamins and amino acids without any calories, dyes, or sugars. So far, I've tried a couple different flavors like this Japanese soda, as well as Dragonade, Beach and Peach, and my favorite so far, which is a watermelon guava flavor called Galaxy Grenade. And guys, Dubby has dozens of flavors to choose from, so there's guaranteed to be one for you. Just mix a scoop of powder in 8 to 12 ounces of water and you're good to go. And if you use the code BDBUCK at checkout, you can get 10% off your order. Just use the link in the description to let them know that I sent you. Say goodbye to caffeine jitters with Dubby and say hello to some more weird guns that we're going to talk about right now. And as always, we're going to start off with another goofy shotgun, but this time we're bringing it back to the Old West. We all know that any good gunslinger is only as good as the gun he's slinging, and when you only have 6 shots, you best make sure they all count. The obvious solution is to give your wheel gun a decent amount of stopping power, and when Samuel Colt was first playing around with that idea, he made the Colt Walker, often labeled one of the most powerful revolvers ever made, so much so that it was considered too much for the US military and had to be toned down in later designs. Now, I say all of that so that you understand just how big of a gun the Colt Walker is, but that's not actually the gun I want to talk about, because there is a custom-made Colt 1855 that makes a Walker look like a pocket revolver by comparison. Now, there is also a different Colt 1855 that is actually a pocket revolver, and it uses a side hammer design made by Elisha Root. That same system was also adapted for a series of long guns, also called Colt 1855s, but they fired larger rounds from a full-length rifle barrel, and this particular custom pistol we're talking about was built from a 10-gauge shotgun variant. All this gun is that full-length long gun cut down with the barrel chopped off at 11 inches and all of the metal pieces that fastened on the buttstock bent and reshaped to fit a pistol grip. It's obviously a one-off build made by who I can only assume was Hellboy in disguise as an 1800s outlaw, but you cannot deny that this gun is, while very ridiculous, really freaking cool. My long-lost father Ian from Forgotten Weapons has a video showing this gun off in detail, and that's where I got most of the info for this thing. So Ian, if you're watching this, thank you. Often labeled one of the first bullpup rifles, the Thorneycroft was an early 1900s bolt action with a mechanism that retracted nearly all the way to the end of the buttstock. It was a shorter and lighter alternative to the Lee Enfield, but poor ergonomics and a terrible recoil kept it from seeing service. One of the many experimental weapons programs from the Cold War era was the Special Purpose Individual Weapons Program, or SPIW. The general idea was to create an assault rifle that fired flechette rounds and had a built-in grenade launcher, so you could literally shoot with needlepoint accuracy or accuracy by area of effect. Now, the rifles created for this program didn't necessarily all have specific designations and were more differentiated by the company or the team that made them. Springfield made a couple different variants between 1963 and 66, with the standout being a bullpup that had a 60-round box mag that was basically just 2 30-round magazines situated in front of one another, feeding off of the front first and then off of the back. The Submission by Winchester attempted to make use of a short recoil spring system in the stock, but it wasn't very reliable and it was later dropped in later models. Its most defining feature was a trigger guard that could swivel out of the way to make room for gloved hands. H&R's rifle was probably the most advanced of the bunch, having been designed by Daniel Dardick to use reworked Trowns from his revolver that were actually triple bored, meaning that while it technically only held 20 rounds, it effectively had the power of 60. However, the way that the flechettes fired caused gas leakages and pressure loss, which decreased range and velocity, sometimes even to the point of losing energy so fast that the rounds would get lodged within the barrel. The trounds were basically held together in the magazine with scotch tape, resulting in a very unreliable feeding system that could even cause the trounds to break apart. The 3-chamber revolving grenade launcher and plastic frame and stock not only made the gun very weirdly heavy, but also poorly distributed with all that weight, and coupled with the exposed revolving chamber, it was not just unwieldy to use, but also ran the risk of catching bare skin or loose clothing in the mechanism. The weapon made by AAI was probably the closest to actually seeing service, likely due to its blistering fire rate of 2,400 rounds per minute in burst mode, and an underbarrel grenade launcher that was built into the frame more comfortably, which would go on to inspire the creation of the M203 shortly after. AAI presented several different variants of the basic design, including one that was belt-fed, as well as one that was a bullpup. For all of the perceived advantages, none of the SPIW flechette rifles proved to be worth replacing the M16 for, and when they realized that you could just put a grenade launcher onto a regular assault rifle and get basically the same effect, the program was shut down, because as cool as the concept of a flechette rifle that shoots little fin-guided needles is, there's a reason that nobody really uses them outside of extremely specialty case purposes. In 1986, the US would again try to replace the M16 with a new program called the Advanced Combat Rifle Project, or the ACR program. Colt themselves basically just took the M16, added some new furniture, and made new cartridges called duplex rounds that were just regular 5.56 shells with 2 bullets stacked on top of each other, and went, "Behold, an advanced combat rifle," but the government was like, no, that seems like it's a bad idea, and it turns out that it was. AAI also jumped into the contest after making further developments on the SPIW gun that, while perfectly functional, couldn't outperform the M16 either. Its biggest drawback was the proprietary caseless ammunition that was basically just powder and the projectile glued together in the shape of a standard 5.56 round, and while you could technically feed a regular cartridge, the gun's mechanism didn't have the capacity to operate with a shell and eject it, so it also needed a proprietary magazine. Steyr also made a weapon for the project that superficially resembled the AUG, but it operated very differently, and rather than the round being pushed up into the chamber in a more typical manner, the chamber actually moved downward to pick up the new round, and surprisingly, the mechanism worked pretty well. The gun fired saboted flechettes that also performed decently, but again, the gun couldn't outperform the M16. The Ares and Olin companies collaborated on a gun called the AIWS, or Advanced Individual Weapons System, that fired a saboted tracer round off of an ammo belt held within a drum mag, with the idea being that the tracer rounds could be used for targeting instead of something more complicated like sights. So yes, it was literally designed for spray and pray, and obviously this was a stupid idea and the gun did not make it past the first round of testing. The McDonnell Douglas company, formerly known as Hughes Helicopter Systems, also made a gun called the AIWS, and while its profile looks a little bit more conventional, its operation was anything but. It fired proprietary cartridges called chiclets on account that they look like those little square candy-coated pieces of gum you get at a dollar store vending machine. All they are is a plastic housing that holds what they called a multiplex round, which was just 2 or 3 bullets stacked on top of each other, with the propellant held in an open compartment on either side of the actual projectile. And as you can probably imagine, this idea did not work too well, and it also required far more gunpowder than any of the other guns in the program, so it was pulled out of the running almost immediately. The last and most recognizable gun from the ACR program was the H&K G11, which had been in development since the 70s, with its latest and last version being submitted to the program. If you aren't familiar with the G11, I did already talk about it in part 1 of the series, so go check that out if you haven't already. But did you know that Mauser and IWK also made their own version of a G11? Neither would see quite as much development as H&K, but they were made to fill very much the same niche. Due to their very short development life, not much information is still around on them, but what is known is that the Mauser used an internal 10-round helical magazine that loaded with stripper clips, and the IWK fired from 3 barrels at once, but couldn't fire on full auto. And I wonder why they failed. The AK-45 was a bullpup assault rifle presented for the 1945 weapon trials by Sergei Korovin. It was built on a tubular receiver, likely inspired by guns such as the Sten or the Volkssturm rifles, but as you can probably figure out, it lost to the AK-47 and has since slipped into obscurity. As Kalashnikov's rifle took the world by storm, many other gun manufacturers tried to copy it or keep up with their own designs, one being the Madsen LAR from Denmark. It was meant to be an alternative to the Soviet-made rifles and marketed to Finland, but it was also more expensive and less reliable, so it was never adopted. When a new version of the rifle came a few years later, it came behind the FN-FAL and the HKG3, and so it was again passed over. Now, I would wager that some of you probably never realized that even though Switzerland is famously a neutral country when it comes to war, and therefore hasn't really had to get involved in many conflicts, they still have a military that uses guns. Their piece of choice for years was the SIG 510 AMT, which is literally a Swiss Army gun. It was built as a universal tool that took the place of a standard K31, the Suomi, the LMG-25, and the Kar-55 sniper rifle. The straight-line recoil puts the center of gravity and buttstock in line with the axis of the barrel, which just means that it's easier to control under automatic and burst fire. The roller delay blowback system isn't too unusual and is seen in other firearms like the G3 or the Setmi, but really all that means is that there's a set of metal rollers that guide the bolt along an internal track. The big problem with this system is that over time the recesses of those rollers will wear down and eventually make the gun unusable, but the SIG 510 combats this by making those roller tracks interchangeable, which drastically increases the lifetime of the gun. The neoprene rubber buttstock and handguard give it a pretty comfy hold from what I hear, and a second fold-away trigger makes it easier to operate with gloves. The gun first saw service with the Swiss military in 1957, but it's actually still in use today, and friend of the channel Administrative Results made a video showing off the gun in more detail, so if you want to learn more, I'll link his video in the description. By 1969, the original Colt 1911A1 was starting to show its age, and so to make sure that they kept the military contract, Colt developed a new age sidearm called the Scamp, standing for Small Caliber Machine Pistol. Only a single functional prototype was ever made, and although it performed fine and got a lot of positive feedback, no one was really interested enough to actually adopt it into service. Multiple calibers were considered for use in the gun, but a proprietary cartridge called 22 Scamp was eventually developed off of the 221 Remington Fireball cartridge, which proved far more effective and accurate at longer ranges than most other military pistols of the day. The idea was for the Scamp to be an even smaller alternative to machine pistols like the Scorpion or the Uzi, and in order to make it more manageable and accurate under burst fire, it was designed with a low-set bore, a built-in muzzle compensator, and a grip pattern styled after competition shooting pistols. Since only one Scamp was ever made, it's probably one of the most obscure guns on this list, but it's also one of the coolest in concept, and I'm honestly really surprised that it hasn't showed up anywhere in media before, but I assume that's only a matter of time. TDI would make a similar gun decades later called the Kard, which uses a modified recoil system to their Vector submachine gun and has appeared in Call of Duty Black Ops 2, but it also never took off and it hasn't really seen any further development since 2011. Now, another failed prospective replacement for a US military weapon was the TRW LMR, or Low Maintenance Rifle. In extremely simple terms, it was basically just a cheaply made FG-42 clone that fed off of Stanag magazines. It was originally commissioned by DARPA to be a low-cost, low-maintenance alternative to the M16 for Allied guerrilla forces in Vietnam, but the US pulled out before all of the kinks could be dealt with, so it never went into production. The development history of the gun was anything but low maintenance, as various mechanical and performance issues plagued its entire lifespan, and it was way easier to just improve the M16 than it was to improve and adopt this new rifle for the very specialty cases it was made for. The Vahan is an Armenian rifle from the 1950s that never actually saw an official test trial. It uses a lever-delayed blowback system like the FAMAS and a two-stage fire control trigger where a half press fires on semi and a full press goes auto. It's been marketed as a simpler alternative to the AK platform that can even allegedly outperform it, but as far as I could find out, no one's ever taken them up on that claim. And that's probably due to a couple of reasons, one of those being flaws with the lever-delayed firing system. While it's a perfectly competent design, lever delay is very sensitive in how it manages cartridge pressures, and even slight differences in bullet weight or powder can cause mechanical issues. The sight setup of the Vahan is also a bit clunky, and the overall ergonomics of the gun are not the most comfortable out there, so there's really nothing going for it. The Yamakov was a Bulgarian prototype designed as another prospective alternative to guns like the SKS and AK-47. According to some reports, it performed as well and possibly even better than the Kalashnikov, with one of its only downsides being an awkward reload. The adoption of the Warsaw Pact standardized weapons across the Soviet Union and its satellite countries, and development of the Yamakov ceased in 1960. The 80.002 was an experimental Soviet combo gun with an AK-style rifle and a grenade launcher situated side by side. It's probably one of the earliest attempts at a next-gen advanced combat weapon like the OICW or the ACR program. The Spasov Trigun was a 3-barreled pump-action SMG variant of the Spasov 1944. It had an extremely high rate of fire, mostly because you're basically shooting 3 submachine guns at once. It used 3 individual barrels, 3 individual firing chambers, and 3 individual magazines, all connected to one trigger and charging handle, which was a manually pumped vertical foregrip. It was obviously too chunky and too clunky, so it got canned. The XM307 is basically a belt-fed XM25 designed as a 2-man mounted weapon or a remote-controlled vehicle turret. It uses the same programmable airburst technology and is meant to suppress entrenched targets or take out light armored vehicles. It was intended as a replacement to the Mark 19 and the M2, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now sure, those guns are very simple by comparison, but the fact that they're still in use is a testament to how effective they are, regardless of any technical gimmicks. That said, the XM307 does exactly what it's intended to do, but for whatever reason, it's never gone beyond experimental use. The AO-27 is more or less an AK-47 adapted for flechettes. It has great penetration and ballistics, but a very low stopping power and very high production costs, so it also never went anywhere. The Emmer K1 is a Burmese rifle reverse-engineered from the QBZ-97 and also partially inspired by the SA-80 and Tavor, with some of the internal mechanisms coming from the M16. Information on the gun is sparse, but everything I could find reports the gun to be pretty unreliable and pretty poor in build quality, and so it's not seen any serious production. Now, if you were to cross the Bren light machine gun with a swordfish, then you'd probably get something like the ZB530. This gun was meant to be a lightweight derivative of the ZB26, serving somewhat the same purpose as an assault rifle, but production ceased when Czechoslovakia adopted 7.62x39 as their standard cartridge. Now, this next gun is one that a lot of your dads will probably recognize, even though only about 100 of these were made. The Pauza P50 was a 50 caliber semi-automatic rifle that, while perfectly competent, like many of these rifles, was overshadowed by more popular or more successful designs like the Barrett M82. It's probably most well known for appearing in the RoboCop films, but it was actually advertised for the civilian market and is largely responsible for starting the 50 caliber craze in the 80s and 90s. Hey Brandon, I was looking through some old photos and it looks very, similar. The Nambu Type 1 saw very limited use with the Japanese Navy, despite no official adoption. The entire front half of the gun reciprocated around the barrel to run the action, and it used a pneumatic buffer that cycled the bolt using compressed air, which could be adjusted with a valve knob to change the bolt delay, which would therefore increase or decrease the fire rate. It was one of the first submachine guns that used magazines loaded into the pistol grip, and it was briefly considered for service by the British as a weapon for tank crews, but it was rejected and Japan ceased exports of the weapon in the 1930s. The Nambu Type 2, as you can probably guess, was the successor to the Type 1, and it was one of several prospective submachine guns in pre-World War II Japan. It used a very similar design and function, with the main changes improving on just the ergonomics, making it more or less just a stock swap out. It didn't see any large-scale production or official service either, but it was one of several last-ditch guns distributed to soldiers towards the end of the war. The TUMA MTE-244 is an often overlooked entry into NATO's PDW program. It used modified 5.56 rounds as an alternative to H&K's 4.6 rounds or FN's 5.7 rounds. The gun was built in 2 variants, a standard semi-auto pistol and a machine pistol, and operationally it was pretty standard, but it had a few unique design elements like a fluted barrel, a slotted slide, and a quick detached suppressor lug. It was slated for production in 2000, but development ended abruptly with little explanation as to why, so it's not really actually known what ended up happening from there. Now, we all know that the Russians were early adopters to a lot of these experimental specialty case gun applications, and the VAG 72 and 73 are no different. These were, of course, experimental Soviet pistols that used caseless ammo similar to the volcanic rocket ball cartridges, where the projectile was hollowed out and filled with propellant, and then a primer cap sealed over the opening on the bottom. The 72 operated more or less like a typical handgun otherwise, but the 73 adapted the build for automatic fire and used a compound magazine that was basically just one in front of the other. When the gun fired, it would feed the top round off of the front compartment into the firing chamber, while also feeding the top round from the rear compartment into the top of the front, thereby emptying the back part of the magazine first and then using the front magazine. Only one of each of these guns was made, and they are now in display at the Artillery Museum in St. Petersburg. The Colt Anti-highjacking revolver was, as you can probably assume, a revolver made by Colt to combat hijacking. All it was a Colt lawman converted to fire sabot plaster of Paris projectiles out of a single-use plastic cylinder. It was developed at the request of Eastern Airlines to equip pilots with something to fight hijackers with that wouldn't blast holes into the hull of the plane, but they eventually realized that they could just bring sky marshals on board and everything would be dealt with. Colt also made another anti-hijacking revolver called the M13 Aircrewman. This gun was just a specialized Cobra revolver with an aluminum frame and cylinder to reduce the weight, which required under-pressured rounds to be used. It could still load and fire regular .38 special ammo, but that would potentially cause pressure spikes that would rupture the cylinder and potentially make the entire gun explode in the shooter's hand. Despite its very niche application, over 1,000 of these guns were actually made, but I don't really know how much they were actually used on airlines.
Hi guys, editing Brandy Buck here. I realized a bit of an untruth I made when talking about the Aircrewman initially. It was never made as an anti-hijacking revolver. It was strictly made for use as a sidearm by U.S. Air Force aircrews, hence the name. The whole concept of an anti-hijacking weapon didn't really come around until about the 60s or 70s, because that's apparently when airline hijackings were becoming more commonplace, and so that's why they made the plaster of Paris gun almost 20 years later. The Aircrewman did actually see official U.S. Air Force service for about 2 years, until they started to realize that even with the lower pressure rounds, the frames would still break down, they would still crack, they wouldn't necessarily explode in the shooter's hands, but the aluminum frame just wasn't as strong as a steel frame, and so they decided not to really use it anymore. So I just wanted to clear that up before anybody calls me out in the comments, and remind you all that it pays to make sure you double check your research.
The Madsen 1907 is largely considered to be the first true light machine gun produced in large numbers and used by multiple countries. The original prototype actually used a fixed gravity-fed stripper clip to feed ammo that couldn't be removed and had to be folded down when not in use, until Wilhelm Madsen realized that that was a horrible idea, and so he redesigned the gun to use a box magazine. The firing mechanism is more or less the Martini-Henry action modified for a hybrid of short and long recoil automatic fire. And as odd and complicated as that sounds, it actually works pretty well, since the Madsen has seen heavy use since 1902, and it's still in service in some places of the world today. The Madsen was actually one of several walking fire guns built in the lead up to World War I, and we've talked about several of them already. One of those was the Chauchat, which is arguably one of the worst machine guns ever built, depending on who you talk to. But would it surprise you to know that there was actually a PDW version of the gun built in 1918 that removed the buttstock and used 8-round end-block clips? Well, it's true. It was also one of the first guns to be referred to as a submachine gun, not because it used a smaller round or anything, since it was still chambered in 8mm Lebel, but because it was just a smaller gun than the one it was based on. It's also one of the first guns specifically built as what we could call a PDW today, because it was intended for use by tank crews and soldiers in close quarters situations. A later design swapped out the end block clip with regular Chauchat magazines, and while that allowed for more shots, it was considered far too powerful for the intended use. And for all its flaws, it was pretty forward-thinking, and even though it never took off, It just shows that even all the way back then, people were already thinking of a lot of the principles we see in firearms today. The McClean Lissak was another prospective light machine gun made at the end of World War I, designed by Samuel Neil McClean. The guy was actually a doctor by trade, but he moonlighted in gunsmithing and made dozens of firearm patents over the years, and he would eventually even leave his medical practice to start his own full-time gun manufacturing company. One of his designs for a mounted machine gun would eventually develop into the Lewis gun, but the automatic rifle we're talking about now was his final attempt to get a gun accepted by the military. Now, he designed the gun entirely on his own, but he got help from Colonel Lissak to promote and market it to the military, and that's where the gun got the alternative name of McClean Lissak, although it was more officially known as the McClean automatic rifle. It operated using an underbarrel gas piston system and a ratcheting gearwork mechanism to feed ammo from a donut-shaped drum magazine that was mounted around the gun and used a dual trigger setup to fire, one for semi and one for auto. The US Navy gave the gun some basic preliminary testing, but General William Crozier wasn't really interested in any guns that weren't designed by a military ordnance contractor, so the gun never went any further than that. Now, this next gun is actually one I've known about for quite a while, and I've been very excited to talk about it because it's not only very weird, but also really stupid. It's called the Viper Carbine, and it was a submachine gun designed in the 40s as a PDW for motorcycle messengers. It was designed to be fired from the hip and cradles under the shooter's armpit, and uses MP40 mags in a system modeled after the Sten action. 3 different versions were designed, but none were ever considered practical, and it's possible that version 2 of the gun was never actually even built. The Viper Carbine is an excellent example of a lot of the mid-1900s guns that were designed for extremely specific specialty applications, and while they would technically work for the one single thing that they were designed to do, if they were ever used or applied in any other situation, then that would indicate just how bad of an idea they were. And obviously, I think that as unique and interesting and dumb as the gun is, it is a perfect weird gun and a perfect gun to close out level 7 of the Weird Gun Iceberg. We have only got one more level to go, guys. There's been a lot of weird guns on this list, and I'm very thankful that you guys have stuck around to listen to me talk about all of these wacky, wild firearms. I've already got a couple different projects lined up after I make part 8, so make sure you stick around for whatever I have coming up next. I'll also be launching a second channel pretty soon where I'll post supplemental content to the stuff I'm posting on the main channel, so that channel's not live and visible yet, but when my next video comes out after the Weird Gun Iceberg, that second channel will also come live. More details will follow as time goes on. I just wanted to let you all know ahead of time so that you have something to look forward to. With all of that said, I want to thank you all again for watching. I really do appreciate all of the support, and I will see you all back here next time. Goodbye, everyone.